First, I want to invite our panelists to all come take their seats on stage, and we'll get started as soon as possible. So this is our Future of Civil Society panel, moderated by our very own Professor Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and resident of the PolicyLink. Come on out. And I appreciate this order. It's not easy after you eat to just get your stuff together and move slowly and quietly, but this is good. This is good. Must be the view. All right, my task is simple. All you all have to do is have a seat, and your microphones, make sure they're working, putting them on. The next panel, the future of civil society, our moderator, of course, is Angela Glover Blackwell. Professor Blackwell is a professor of practice at the Goldman School of Public Policy and Chief Vision Officer for our Democracy Policy Initiative in Future, hopefully Flourishing Democracy Institute. She's also the founder and resident of the research and advocacy nonprofit PolicyLink, which she founded in 1999. Please join me in welcoming Professor Angela Glover Blackwell.
This has been an exciting day, and it's been a real privilege to hear the panels that preceded, and you really set a very high bar for how to talk about these issues in ways that are very real and very grounded, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to introduce the panel in a moment, but I really like that we're talking about the future of civil society. And a lot of what our panel is going to do is really kind of raise the question, are we looking for civil society in all the wrong places? To try to really get us to focus on civil society and what is its purpose in civic life, that it is just so essential if we're going to have a thriving democracy, that we understand that that really means how are we struggling and negotiating and debating the issues that impact our lives in the public square. How's government and the market and the people, how are they coming together to be able to talk about these issues? Being able to do that with truth and authenticity and being connected to the issues that really impact what's going to happen in the future depends on having organizations and an infrastructure that the people can connect with, and that's civil society. Lots of us have been wringing our hands about the civil society and its health and its well-being and what it's doing and what it's not doing. And what we have been missing is that the way that we have emerged, civil society is alive and well within the very entities who have skin in the game for whether or not this works, who have skin in the game around the issues of affordability and know what that really means, who have skin in the game in terms of representation, who have skin in the game in terms of jobs and do they pay and are they connected. People for whom community is everything because it is everything that they have. And so we're going to be talking about that. But before we begin, I just wanted to share with you the way that I think of democracy. That when I use the term, what I'm looking at, what I'm thinking about, what I'm hoping for, is a radically inclusive, mutually accountable democracy in service of human flourishing so that society can thrive and everyone can have a good life. That's what democracy is really about. And we're going to be talking about how civil society is going to help us get there. Joining us for this really important discussion, we have exactly the names that are here. We have Manuel, who is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. We have David Huerta, who is the head of the, I know it's SEIU, but I want to make sure I get it right. He is the president of SEIU in California. And we have Joseph McKellar, who is the executive director of PICO. And we have Judy Samuelson, who is with the Aspen Institute. And she's the Founder and executive director of what you see there. I actually have it on my phone, but you know how it is when you're trying to do things off your phone, it disappeared, and I didn't want to have to struggle with that. But that is our panel, and we are going to get started right now, and I'm so excited that we have them. That could have been a disaster. So, I want to start off by talking about what I was just teeing up for us, which is the civil society that has been growing out of necessity and beginning to understand why it is so essential for where it is that we are going. One of the things that I have been talking about for a very long time, and many of you have heard me talk before, have heard me talk about it, but some of you have not heard it, and I want to make sure that it grounds our discussion. And that is the curb cut effect. That I wrote an article years ago, I think it was 2017, it was in SSIR, called The Curb Cut Effect. And the point it was making was this, that those cutouts in the sidewalk that are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs serve us all. Whether we're pushing a stroller, whether we have a 7-year-old new bike rider who can traverse the neighborhood sidewalk to sidewalk rather than in the street, whether it's a worker who's pulling a cart, pulling a wagon, pushing something, even saves lives because 9 out of 10 unencumbered adults cross the street at the corner because of the orientation of the curb cut. The lesson from that is when we solve problems with nuance and specificity, focusing on those who have been kept and left behind, we solve problems in ways that are sustainable. We don't have to keep coming back to them again and again because the benefits cascade out. When you think about civil society and civic life and democracy, what we know is that we have organized in communities, that we have organized around a rich community life in the very communities in which people have been kept and left behind. That we have been focused on what it is that has to change, not just for the individuals, but for the broader community in order to be able to overcome the issues that have really plagued us in the past. And what we're needing to focus on now is that as we feel that we're about to see a collapse of democracy, that there's so many things in society that are clearly not working, is that the very people who have been fighting for those who have been most marginalized now have an opportunity to lead for the whole, to be able to use their deep wisdom about what is holding everybody back to create a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And so I want you to just pick up on that as each of you talk from your own point of view about how you see the strengths. We've talked a lot about the weaknesses and the threats. This is a conversation about strengths. What's been built over the years? And Joseph, I want to start with you because you are so close to the ground in the work that you are doing.
Well, thank you, Angela. It's been on my bucket list to be on a panel moderated by Angela Glover Blackwell. Thank you, Angela. I don't know if you heard earlier, but the football players were practicing down here and they were playing Kendrick Lamar, They Not Like Us. And I thought that was a perfect walk-up song for Angela. So there are many civil society leaders in this room. I want to recognize a number of my colleagues from the Million Voters Project and We Are California, which I'll talk more about some of the ways in which we are embodying solidarity and building infrastructure for civil society to really meet this very dangerous moment, so full of peril, but also a lot of promise. And PICO California is a faith-based community organizing network. We organize with 550 congregations up and down the state, over half of the state Senate and Assembly districts. And 4 weeks ago, actually today, or 4 weeks ago yesterday, I was in a meeting with Pope Leo, the new Pope, the first US Pope in Rome, at this meeting of popular movement leaders from all over the world.
That's what we call name dropping.
I started with Angela Glover Blackwell, everybody. I started at the top. And then I went to Kendrick Lamar, okay? And then Pope Leo, just for the record. And he said two things to me. To your question, Angela, about like, what are the strengths of civil society? He said two things that continue to stir in my spirit 4 weeks later. One, he looked at us and he said, your job and our job in these times is to unleash a torrent of moral energy. Unleash a torrent of moral energy. And the second thing he said is we must all become poets of solidarity. And I love both of those notions. I'll start with poets of solidarity because social change and social progress is never linear. It isn't a formula. Social change is an art. Building civil society and community organization is a form of art. It has many detours, many steps forward and steps backward, steps to the left, steps to the right. But it requires us to summon a better part of ourselves, to build bridges across difference, to share a part of our own stories, our pain, our fears, also our hopes and dreams. It requires us to be creative and entrepreneurial and take risk, especially in times like these. So I love the idea of being poets of solidarity. And unleashing a torrent of moral energy, Angela, I see leaders in this room and across our communities doing that every day at a time of rapid authoritarian consolidation, which is what we are all experiencing. I see in places like Los Angeles, where David Huerta's leadership has just been exemplary, everyday people choosing to walk into courthouses with migrants and refugees who have court hearings and ICE check-ins in the hopes that they could shield them from being deported. I see people holding vigils and marches and processions and protests in big and very small ways, but to bear witness to the pain of families being torn apart. I was at a food distribution program, a soup kitchen, a couple of days ago at a church, talking to volunteers who have seen the lines explode at soup kitchens based upon most recently cuts to SNAP and food access and people losing money in their EBT cards. But they're showing up because they find purpose, they find community, they find it to be an act of resistance. And I see us holding corporations accountable, many of which are complicit in allowing for this authoritarian consolidation to take place. Some of us pushed the LA Dodgers, go LA Dodgers, World Series champs, wow, we're in the Bay Area, aren't we? My Lord. My Lord. Never mind that example. Well, just so you know, we held them accountable. Okay, that was the story. We pushed them to own up to the values that they espouse and to make a statement about family separations and raids. And most recently, we're trying to hold Home Depot accountable, a corporation that is also complicit, that is allowing AI to be utilized on their properties to track people's license plates as a way of fueling bounty hunting, which is what's happening in our communities through family separations. This is all being done by civil society, everyday people choosing, making the choice to step out into public life, summoning the courage and meeting the moment.
I want to ask you a follow-up because you've described what people are willing to do, but I also know that PICO has been there with people during personal sad times, during community struggle. Talk about the relationship between the organizing that has happened and the readiness of people to be able to step forward.
Well, you know, so much of organizing in this form of civil society is about building community and forging shared identity, which Manuel's work has been so instructive in his teachings about what makes movements across not just this country, but the world really thrive. And good organizing starts with asking the question, what is it like to be you? And it also asks the question, who do you love? Because organizing is never about someone in our communities doing something for a paid staff member of a nonprofit or for a community organizer. Organizing is always about someone doing something for themselves and the people that they love. Organizing is about creating the conditions for people, everyday people, especially those on the margins, especially those who have the most at stake, to become authors of their own futures, rather than just consumers of a future that's being given to them. And that is the way most poor and marginalized and vulnerable people experience the world, as though there's nothing they can do to change it. They're told a story that they don't matter, that their voice doesn't have bearing in what happens in the world. And organizing creates the conditions for people to become protagonists, to not be just observers on the sidelines, but to do so in a way that engenders agency, human agency. And I think that is at the core of what any thriving democracy, any thriving civil society sector needs, is agents, individual people making a choice every day to overcome their fears, to step out, to link arms with people, even people who they disagree with. And I know we're going to talk in a little bit, Angela, about the ways in which civil society needs to evolve. I think too much of civil society is interested only in preaching to the choir, rather than building a bigger tent of folks who might not agree on everything, but with the language of values and emotions can come to act and love one another. So that's some of what we try to do, is create those conditions alongside our partners, again, in the Million Voters Project, in We Are California, and many other coalitions that we're a part of.
Thank you. Judy, I'm going to come to you last on this first round because I want to hear how you think business is reacting to some of this. But David, I want to go to you next because I have a podcast called Reimagining Democracy for a Good Life. And the first season focused on Los Angeles because it was about multiracial democracy. And it felt like there is a place where multiracial democracy is really flexing its muscle. And in this 6-part podcast, the third one was called Labor of Love, because it really focused on how the organizing that had happened in the Black and Latino and the Asian communities, people were organizing within groups, and then they came together to begin to organize together. But it really wasn't until it connected with labor that it began to get the power that it needed to make some of the changes that we're seeing. So talk about labor in LA and all of these issues.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, I think, right now in this moment, I think I'm very proud of our city, Los Angeles. Amazing work that they did when ICE first hit the streets and started, kidnapping and taking people. The resistance that was there was not something that showed up just overnight. It's something that had been worked on for some time now. There was a preparation that was being put into that was being harnessed and made as a means to be able to resist, knowing that it was coming. And we knew that we were going to be targeted, which kind of put me in that 15th and Santa Fe that day, on that first day on June 6th. But, the work that we've been doing, and I'm really proud of SEIU. SEIU as a whole, I would say, was probably one of the first organizations to come out and actually take a position as being an anti-racist organization. And we did that, under the leadership of Mary Kay Henry, and continue to do that with April Verrett, our president. And, I think that those steps that we took early on was really as a means to really try to see how we can figure out how we not only raise the question about being an anti-racist organization, but also the race-class narrative as a whole. And how do we continue to combat that? How do we start to continue to engage it in a way that really helps rebirth a new movement, right? One of the things I'm so proud of about my organization, United Service Workers West, is that, for a long time we were predominantly known as the Latino Union, because of Justice for Janitors, and rightfully so, but there's a whole story behind that and a history behind that. Those janitors that came from Central America fleeing violence, fleeing the central, violence of the civil wars, poverty, et cetera, because poverty is violence, came and basically displaced the whole Black industry, right? Or janitors at that time that were cleaning all the high-rise. Well, those high-rises had been built. They were on the process of being built, and those owners took advantage of that labor pool that was coming in. But, when we came in out of the 90s and then, organized justice for janitors and really demonstrated the power of working people, especially immigrant labor, right? Because that's what that campaign has done, is really amplified the power of immigrant labor, but working people. We also then engaged in a one of the biggest organizing efforts west of the Mississippi when it involved Black workers in the security industry, where 60% of the workers are Black. And bringing those two campaigns together into one place was not easy. Tensions were there. The tensions were very real. The tensions you saw on the streets on a daily basis when two marginalized communities were being marginalized, they marginalized each other at the same time. And, because when you're talking about being on the margins, it's very difficult to be able to share when you're on the margins because you're really hoarding everything you can to keep some semblance of power or substance. But we really worked hard to really figure out how we bring within our organization both Black and brown voices and empowerment. And we had to really start first by really acknowledging the difference in the room and allowing difference to exist. Allowing people to show up authentically in a very real way and really challenging each other, challenging our members, challenging me as a Latino labor leader, right? On how I was gonna show up differently and allow difference to really flourish, to really exist. And so, I think what LA, in my opinion, the microcosm that is USWW, I think is starting to really evolve in a very different way now, in a very real way, I should say, that I think is really starting to bring power. Because I think one thing that I would say is, in Los Angeles, one of the things I really feel that is really real about the situation is that, the circumstances, the reality of what exists is being confronted every single day in Los Angeles. And I think that reality that is merging out of that is really showing up, I think, in the same way in Chicago, in the same way in DC, what you see right now in Charlotte, right? What you're seeing in so many different cities is now being replicated elsewhere. And, I think if we're gonna make our way out of this, we cannot make our way out of this without Black and brown community coming together in solidarity, but with authenticity and allowing difference to exist, to emerge as one. And I think that's what's really gonna be, hopefully, the saving grace coming out of this. Because one thing I just want to finish, I really believe that the people who are now being targeted are actually gonna be the folks who actually save our democracy.
Manuel, I want to turn to you, and you must have thought, perhaps you didn't, but the name here, this uncommon, about over 20 years ago, Manuel and I wrote a book together with Stuart Quo called Searching for the Uncommon Common Ground. And we were talking then about how we had to find a way through our differences. And it's just been such a pleasure to have stayed in partnership with you throughout all these years. But what I like about you so much in the way that you think, Manuel, is that you always figure out what the 3 things are that we need to do to win.
So go for it. So first, super glad to be here. Again, I think all of us, when we grow up, we want to be Angela Glover Blackwell. And I don't mean to top my good friend Joseph, but the other day I was having a face-to-face conversation with God. So, she asked about you. I also realized that as Jesse started the day, basically running away from being from USC. I am too, but anyway, so, and one last, I was like, Angela and others know this, I like to let people know if while you're hearing me, my voice sounds kind of scratchy and worn out, you might think it's from screaming at ICE agents, partly. But it's also that I've got a speech condition, spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box, which has now been made famous. It's the same condition Robert Kennedy Jr. has, how his voice sounds scratchy. So if my voice was not treated, I would sound like Robert Kennedy Jr. I would not be as fucking delusional as Robert Kennedy Jr. But I would sound that way. So I guess I'll do three things. Yeah. And I'll come at the end with later and another with three things we need to do. But 3 points right now is this point about looking for civil society in all the wrong places. And, you know, we're all think about the book Bowling Alone. And even then I thought, well, people seem to be playing soccer together. And one of the things that's been really striking about Los Angeles, Joseph and I were out on one of the first days at City Hall. There was supposed to be a prayer vigil, and it got called off because violence was occurring. So naturally, Joseph and I went down there looking for people who looked like they wanted to pray. They were obvious. Other people were down there to engage in trouble with the police. People really were provocateurs. But there was a group there that was actually really surprising. It was working class, mostly Latino, mostly young, really pissed off. And what you've seen in the last, David had been arrested, and 4 days later, 30,000 people came out on the street to demonstrate for his release. And then people have been engaging in civil society. They're challenging the raids. They are challenging ICE in their neighborhoods. They're challenging seeing their neighbors snatched. And if we start looking for civil society in traditional institutions, we're going to miss what is really going on the ground. It's going on with labor, it's going on with community. And you can talk about the immigrants, but when you see black folks in Chicago say, you should not be doing this in our neighborhood. When you see white suburban moms being among those who are calling us right now, who sat in the streets at the Broadview detention facility in Chicago, or there's a whole lot of white people in Charlotte right now that are organizing for the defense. I think that what's being touched by this is something really important. So civil society is different than what we're always thinking about. Second thing I wanted to say is that when we think about civil society and civil discourse, we tend to think about how we can bring people together of different perspectives to converse. And I do think that's important. But some years ago, I was in, and I think you were there as well, that this particular trip in South Africa, and I kept remembering that people keep talking about Nelson Mandela and how when he was in prison, he learned Afrikaans, he learned how important rugby was to the Afrikaners. When he became president, he celebrated the sport, he tried to bring people together. This is also the same guy that refused to renounce the Communist Party, that refused to be allowed out of prison if coming out of prison meant renouncing armed struggle against a government that was engaged in armed struggle against his community. He was a weaver, but he was also a warrior. And I think one of the difficult things we need to balance is what sounds like an anodyne practice of building civil society with the fact that we actually also need to build fighting organizations that can topple authoritarianism, that have a focus on conversation, but also have a focus, clear-headed, on power building. I think that's what labor does. I think we need to certainly engage our business community in this as well. The last thing I'll say of the first triplet is that building a big tent does mean going out to speak to people you're not comfortable with. After the raids, being the nerd that I am, I had a really interesting experience with this. Is we brought our staff together, and turned out that 3 of our 25 staff had relatives taken away in the first weekend. And naturally, my managing director, being very humane, said, gosh, if you need time to be with family, for everybody to process this. And when she got done, I said, and if the rest of you want to get to work, I've got a project, right? Because we do these estimates undocumented. So within a week, we put out the fact that 1/5 of LA County is either undocumented or part of a mixed status family. And businesses, 30 to 40% of our frontline construction workers are undocumented. We're not recovering from the fires if we let people be so terrorist. And naturally, I provided that information from immigrant rights activists, but I also spoke to our Association of Governments, bipartisan. I spoke to one of our largest business groups, helped motivate them to put their toe into this struggle that's something of interest to them. And I spoke to the LA Rotary Club. One person resigned, but the rest went, oh my gosh, I understand this interdependence. So I think the other part of this is we need to have conversation, power building, and we need to figure out how to build a bigger tent by reaching out to audiences that once they know some of these facts and stories may come to the side of democracy.
I thank you. Before I turn to you, Judy, I just wanted to lift up some of what is so essential here in terms of understanding how we tap the resources we already have for the strength in civil society that we need for the struggle that is in front of us. One of the things that you definitely see happening is the parties, everybody trying to get in front of this issue of affordability. Well, this is not a new conversation. This is the conversation that Joseph and all of PICO and all of this community organizing has always been about. We need to be owning that conversation, lifting the bar, and framing it appropriately. And we have the assets to do that and organizations that have been mining that. Everybody is wringing their hands over how do we cross lines of difference? How do we talk to people who we think we have nothing in common with? And David just told us a very real-time, real-life story about Black and brown competition being able to get lifted up to power to deal with the underlying issues. And so, Judy, I want to ask you about so much of what has been the struggle up till now has been how to be able to build a more inclusive society. And we've seen that get lifted up within businesses and all over. And I will tell you, the first time that I heard of an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I literally turned to whoever I was sitting next to and said, well, that's the end of equity. That if you can put it in a department, then you can certainly get rid of that department. And I have to say, I was wrong. Because it happened so much across so many places that millions of people learn things they would have never learned. They have had relationships and conversations they would have never had. And in some ways, you just can't unring that bell. Am I wrong?
I think we better stop right here, I think. I don't know that we're going to get any better than that. Thank you, Angela. Thank you for having me here. I grew up in California, in Southern California, went to UCLA, go Bruins, go Dodgers, before the Padres existed. I grew up in San Diego. And I came to Sacramento on the UC, go to government program. And it was interesting because in the time that I was there before I went east for business school and never made it home again, there are two expectations of business: create jobs, pay your taxes. I don't think we can take either of those for granted today. And so we're in a profoundly different place than when I went into banking and then started working on these questions when I was at the Ford Foundation. And now running this program at the Aspen Institute. It's all about how do we align business decisions with the long-term health of society. That's essentially why we exist. And I think we're in a incredibly complicated moment where we are actually kind of saying, why are we not, what is the word you used, that Pope Leo used? The quest for moral energy, absolutely. Who in this room thinks we're going to get that from business today? And yet, I think it is about, are we looking in the right places? Because I think that the idea that we're going to get from business, let's remember, we're going to be in a few weeks marking a year since a CEO was gunned down on 6th Avenue in Midtown because he ran a healthcare company and somebody didn't like, and you can argue about whether or not U.S. healthcare is a great example of moral anything, but none of us think that the right solution is to be killing off executives. And yet, we're in a moment where we're still kind of wishing, hoping for business to stand up for something here as bold and as important as democracy. We all know or can align the business motivation for supporting rule of law. And yet, I guess, again, in this moment, it sometimes feels like, well, maybe they care mostly about rule of law when their own corporation is at risk somehow. But I think we're in a profoundly complicated time where the expectations of business may be out of alignment with the true risks that business faces if they stand up. And not everybody wants business to stand up on a whole host of things that kind of is in front of the citizenry and the people of the great state of California and well beyond. And so we had a moment in time where it felt like business was kind of standing up for a whole host of social issues. And I think, in some respects, the last several years have been, in a good way, clarifying for business. We can argue about whether or not DEI is being upheld. I think it's a good story basically there. It's kind of common sense. I could come back to that. But I think it's also a time in which the risks, both personal and professional and for their business, are real. And we're going to be hard-pressed to find business people that can bet their entire enterprise on standing up for something that, even as grounded as we think democracy is, to make it actually rebound to the business in a way that somebody is willing to bet the bank is a very complicated undertaking for a senior executive. So I guess I'd come back to a few places that I think we ought to be looking that are not necessarily about hearing business voice. And what are we talking about anyway when we say we want to hear business voice? Isn't it certain voices that we might respect in business? Business is amorphous. It means lots of different things. It's, are we talking about global enterprises? Are we talking about the guy who runs a, store down the street? I mean, we're not at all clear necessarily about what we want, but there is this sense that business can be useful and should be standing up in this moment. And that's in part because business is kind of trusted. Edelman's Trust Barometer is always saying, business is the most, trusted institution in the whole parameter of institutions that Edelman looks at. And it usually hovers at around 60% of the public trust business, which is pretty appalling that that's the highest grade of any institution. I don't think that would have gotten me out of Poway High School. But it is true that business is trusted, but they're not trusted because they're more influential or smarter or more capable. It's because they are viewed as being capable of getting things done. the public and employees and other people believe business is a trusted institution because we can count on them to execute, which is quite different than why we're calling out for business to have a voice in this moment and why we want to hear from them. And so I think those things are slightly different. But let me just say that I think that in some ways the easiest place for business to stand up, and let's be specific, CEOs, chief executives of enterprises that have some real weight in civil society, they've done a tremendous amount on getting out the vote. I mean, that's become kind of a norm. You know, you can give the day off. You're going to maybe even give an extra day if somebody's helping out at the polling place. Let's not forget that. That is an important piece of what business does. Business, because they're kind of trusted, are unusual places also because they are so polyglot. You don't necessarily know who the person on the other side of the, cubby, who they're voting for, but you're probably more inclined to have a conversation with somebody at business about kind of these tensions than your next door neighbor, unless you know that neighbor really well and know that you're already aligned. And so we're in an interesting place where business could actually open up the workplace in an important way to practice civil society. And I tried this out on a couple of people I was sitting with. I think they're both kind of going, really? How would that work? But I think it's actually an interesting domain. And then this question of voice. I mean, I would argue that business, like everybody else we've talked about today, there's safety in numbers. And when business has a coalition, it's easier, right? So that they're not individually at risk. And we've had a great number, if you go back to Trump 1, there have been very significant moments when business has really stood up. Think about the majority Muslim country ban that Trump put in this first year in office. And the Silicon Valley guys, a lot of whom had immigrated here from somewhere else, they quickly acted and it had an impact, right? Or when Ken Chenault and Ken, the other Ken from Merck, a coalition of Black business leaders, the We Stand for Democracy, 2 pages in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, in the wake of George Floyd and the actions questioning the election, all of this We Stand Democracy, that was quite a remarkable moment. And we've had others, the boycotts of Russia in the wake of the Ukraine. That's a business moment that's still ongoing. So it's not that business can't act. The question is how much things have shifted now and whether or not business is going to do what you think you want them to do, and can we be clear about what that is? And then the last thing I would say about kind of in setting this up is just how important the employee is. What we really want, I think, when we parse business voice, is we really want the executive to understand who is the enterprise, to drop the stakeholder-ish language and to powerfully think about who are they speaking to. And we could talk about the moments of when business voice has really made a difference in standing up and speaking to their employees themselves. There's much more to be said about this topic. I think there's a lot of places we need to be holding business to account that are actually undermining democracy. And that's a whole different conversation. It's a complicated topic, but I'm quite bullish that business can make rational and important decisions and be a leader if the conditions can even possibly allow them to do so.
I thank you all for those comments, and I'm going to come back and talk about the challenges of being able to tap these extraordinary assets, and I hope that you're all agreeing that they are extraordinary assets as we think about civil society. But before I do, I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions so that as we are having our conversations, we're responding to what's on your mind. We put out some ideas here. How is this landing with this audience? Just raise your hand. The mic will come to you. We'll take a couple and then comment.
Well, first of all, thank you all. This has been an amazing and surprisingly humorous panel. I'm really struck by some of the last few comments. I'm Aaron Robertson. I work with Catalyst California. Judy, you talked about the conditions that enable businesses to act. And we have two folks on this panel representing PICO and SEIU that I've actually worked with on designing campaigns to try to push corporate enablers and through economic pain. So I'm curious across the group, strategies that you see to effectively move the business sector as one of the pillars of our society to push back against authoritarianism, and what you believe would be most effective.
Other questions? Yes. I think you need to wait for the mic.
I work with a lot of local governments, and I just want to add to that authoritarianism and the bully nature that we're seeing has really bled through to local government in a way, and local folks are trying to figure out. They know corruption's happening. They're trying to reach out to the business community. They're trying to reach out to local faith leaders and labor leaders. But this, what Manuel said about the civil society piece, it's regular people. It is moms and dads going after work and trying to figure out, why is there corruption in my community, and how do I take action on it, and why are institutions not taking action on it? Why am I, as an individual, as a parent after school, trying to figure out why my school board is corrupt, right? So I love the question. I just want to add on, particularly this regular civil society, what should they do?
Let's take a third question. Yeah. We'll take 4. Go.
Well, I actually want to connect this panel to the first panel about the future of universities. I think the president of Johns Hopkins was talking about, where are students? I think someone else asked that. Where's the activism? Why are people outreach about what's happening? And he talked a little bit about the fact that PhD students were organizing and there was silence. So just talking about uncommon challenges. Also, where are the uncommon alliances, right? How are we thinking about civil society to also be able to help the academy, right? And not just from the perspective that a lot of the students who are graduating are actually coming out and being part, and they already are part of civil society and are voting and are starting organizations. But also I think about SEIU, USWW. A lot of your members have children who are the first generation students that are coming to UC, state universities, and are interested in saving this institution. So where are we seeing uncommon alliances through academia, obviously business, labor, and community organizations?
Which one? This one?
Actually, this really builds very well off of this terrific question, which is, thank you, you're amazing people. Really wondering to what extent it's important when we're thinking about pluralism to think about a collective we. And if we're thinking about a collective we, how do we build these uncommon alliances, getting us to think of one another as being important, valued, collaborative partners?
Great. So I'm just going to set these questions up for you to talk about the challenges, because this really got us to the challenges. The challenges, we're talking about the power that we've built up from those who have been most marginalized. And how do we turn that power toward where there is entrenched power? How do we move the businesses? How do we move things that are much more, they loom large in society? The question is, as we're thinking about doing that, what about the people? If you're lucky enough to be in an organization, you can rely on your leaders, they can call out, but there's so many people who sit and are throwing at their televisions. They don't know what to do about what's happening to them. How do we give people a path to be able to participate? What about the uncommon alliances? How do we make sure that we actually are taking advantage of the fact that students in particular are facing challenges that cause them to have to think a little differently about who to align with? And how do we actually build the collective? Ultimately, what we hope will happen in civic life is that we are doing collective decision making, that we are modeling what we hope the democracy will be. Take those ideas and questions as you talk about the challenges that you're trying to deal with. Who would like to start?
Well,
Okay.
I'll start with just trying to clarify a little bit what I mean by what needs to be true for business to stand up. The reason I think this period where there's been a pushback has been useful because it's actually forced businesses to say, if we exist to provide products and services and to honor the license to operate, which is granted by the state, what does it look like if we're actually fulfilling that? And that does not mean they're going to stand up for every social, good out there that we might want to hear business opining on, or at half of the employees in their company may want them to opine on, the other half may be silent. So, the professional service firms, sell a matrix that says, you better be real clear where you stand in 4 different domains of voice. The first one is it actually authentic? Do you really have a reason to say something here? Where is the connection back to the business would be the fundamental question. Another aspect of that would be, is there legitimacy? Do you know the subject matter well enough to speak to it? I can't help but look out on the Salesforce tower from where I sit right now and think about Mark Benioff, $18 million, is that what he wanted to throw in to solve homelessness in San Francisco? Well, what does he know about homelessness? My eyes were rolling all the way across the country when he said he was going to solve homelessness with his out of his pocketbook. That's not a legitimate, authentic voice from where I sit. It's a moneyed voice. It's a wish that he could make this problem go away. He's got a big tower. He can't leave now, right? But that's not necessarily what we're looking for from business. Does it matter? Does it matter to the constituents on which the codependent relationships on which business depends to survive for the long haul? And then finally, this question of risk and reward. So the best business guys are real clear why they're in business, and they're able to use that as a foundation for when to speak and how to speak. I'll only leave you with this. Tim Cook, who's probably not the most popular business leader in the Bay Area right now for the number of times he shows up at the White House, but when Robbie Starbuck went after Apple and went after Costco and went after Walmart for their DEI policies, it was interesting. I thought Costco gave a beautiful statement, and of course their business model is consistent with their beautiful statement, but I liked what Tim Cook did. He essentially said, "You're telling Apple who to hire? We got this. This is a team sport. We know how to build teams. We know who we need at the table. We understand the dynamics of what makes an organization function well, and we can hire whoever we damn well please. Get out of here." And it worked. They stopped. They stopped doing this kind of thing in the stock market. So I think there's different ways that business people can stand up powerfully, but they have to know what business they're really in, on which they're codependent, the things they're codependent, and then they can speak more powerfully to whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, or environmental sustainability, or any number of things that do rebound and are closely tied to the health of our democracy.
And I think the question is about how do the people change that dynamic and get them to speak on what the people want them to speak on. David?
And I think that's a good segue because, I think for too long now we have had an imbalance in this economy, right? It wasn't too long ago that labor represented 30% of workers in our workforce. In the private sector, we're down to 6%. I think between public and private sector, I think we're down to 10%. So that means only 1 out of every 10 workers right now has a union. And when you take into consideration the gig platforms, you take into consideration owner-operators and all these different type of schemes that they've created, I think right now we're down to only 70% of the workforce is actually organizable under the rules of the National Labor Relations Act, right? So they've created a way of diminishing the ability to organize. And unfortunately, and I'm going to be critical here, is that labor for too long has been stuck in a transaction as opposed to looking for transformation. And I think right now, and I'm going to toot SEIU's horn, we're the ones who went out there and said we demand $15 for every worker, right? We got it in California, we didn't get it in Alabama. Where's my Alabama sister? It represents poverty when people are still making $7.25 an hour. Right? That is, like I said, poverty is violence. It is another form of violence, but it's violence nonetheless. And, I think, when we look at what we've done here in California, we recently now have the ability to be able to organize gig workers in California. We organize childcare workers. We organize fast food workers against the rules that they've established. We're creating our own rules. But I think we have to start looking at what do we have to do as labor, because we're the only ones, if you think about LA, the LA County Federation of Labor unions as a whole represent 800,000 workers in Los Angeles. Imagine the possibilities if we were to start moving beyond a transaction of a contract and start talking to those workers about the transformation in their lives and the transformations for all workers in Los Angeles, the power we'd be able to create, not only to take on the authoritarian that's in the White House right now, but to reform and reshape a new economy.
And so it's part of the challenge to be able to actually figure out how to build organization on top of the shared interests of the new labor movement and the people in the communities that they come from?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's where it comes, right? Is like when I look at our members, when I talk to our members, when I look at our members, when we talk to our members, we talk much further. I mean, right now, I am an organizer right now, moving labor, working people to take on fascism. That's my role right now. That's what I feel is my mission and purpose right now, to take on this authoritarian, squash him, and start building something better. And I think we have to be able to, when you see working people, right? And, a lot of people use the term low-wage workers, right? I hate the term low-wage workers. I hate it because no one should be defined by the wages they make, and no one should be defined by if they are documented or undocumented. Workers are workers regardless of their status and regardless of the wages they make and who they work for. Our responsibility and my job is to organize the industries they belong to and lift the conditions, but as I lift those conditions, to get them to focus as well on how we broaden the power for working people across the table.
Yeah, thank you. Joseph, two of the questions were about uncommon alliances and collective purpose. How do we get there? I know you talk so much, Joseph, about love and community and morality. And those are such universal aspirations. And yet it is so hard to talk about it across our differences.
Yeah, so I have a 3-point plan for that.
Okay.
I want to insert another trinity here into the conversation. Maybe try to integrate some of the questions that were asked. Some of this was inspired by my conversation with Kathy Cha over there from Haas Jr., who I love and is brilliant. I think that the civil society sector is too small. It's too boutique still. And some of that is due to structural challenges of the likes that David just talked about. But some of it is because of, I think, the nonprofitization of our civil society sector. I think a lot of our organizations spend a ton of their time trying to maintain nonprofits. And the infrastructure and the staffing and the finances and the HR and everything that is involved with maintaining necessary institutions that are the containers for our work, but that oftentimes limit our ability to be relevant on the front lines with real people every day. And to Manuel's earlier point, I think we talk to ourselves a little bit too much. And so the 3-point plan, I think, and I probably stole this from Manuel at some point, to be honest, but it sort of conveniently starts with 3 S's. I think we need to get to greater scale, more profound and impactful stories, and deeper solidarity. So scale, story, and solidarity. On the scale front, I think in organizing today, we have a supply side challenge. How many of you saw or went to one of these No Kings rallies that have happened this year? Remember, we're in the Bay Area, everybody. How many of you looked at the tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of people across the country who came out those days and said, what's the next step? Where do they go from here? What are they being channeled into? I think that is a challenge across civil society right now. I think that there are way more people who want to help, who want to get involved, than we are able to create opportunities for. It's great to have a protest, a march, every once in a while. On December 12th, SEIU and PICO and a number of our partners, Chirla, are gonna have a big procession on the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, a big day in the Latino Catholic community to shine a light on the needs and stories of immigrants right now. Those are great, but we need to create many more opportunities for people to get involved and stay involved, and in the process forge shared identity and community. That is how we're gonna grow to a different level of scale. And quick story, I mentioned earlier that I was at a soup kitchen, a food distribution program at a church earlier this week. And I was talking to some of the guests, and I talked to some of the volunteers, and I talked to the director of the program. And she was like, thank you for coming. Thank you for helping out today. She said, you know, God over government. She goes, you know, this just shows that generous people are the ones who will save the day. Government just will always let us down. Now, this is a woman who's dedicating a big part of her life to feeding the hungry right now, of which there is a growing number. But it isn't necessarily the case that just because someone shows up for a march or a rally or is in civil society that they agree on every issue under the sun. I think it's part of our job to create the conditions for her to connect the dots to some of these bigger structural challenges and political and economic realities that are happening in our world, because people can and do change. They can go on a journey to becoming a more expansive, more awakened version of themselves. So that's scale. On the story front, I think we have to tell a more expansive story about who matters, who belongs, to your point, Angela, rooted in love, rooted in the language of values and emotions, not so much policy or even ideology. I think that has become the language of civil society too often. But if we're gonna get the director of that food distribution program to come into a more expansive version of herself, she has to be in the conditions where a story is being told about human beings and about families rather than a politician or some ideological stance. And then the third point, and I'll end with this, is solidarity. You know, many of us are products of a great civil society leader named Anthony Thigpen, who started California Calls. And Anthony has always challenged us in this sector to break out of a mentality of empire building and competition and individualism that so, I think, reflects our country and the American experience. And we need solidarity more than ever. We need infrastructure that creates incentives for people who work on different issues, with different constituencies, different geographies. James Woodson is here from the California Black Power Network. They care about Black power. We need Black power in this state and in this country to create a more egalitarian society. And they know that they also need people across difference to fight for Black people and Latinos and poor white people and working class people across the political spectrum. So we need deeper solidarity in the spirit of Pope Leo calling us to be poets of solidarity these times.
Thank you so much for that. Manuel, I want to turn to you to give your comments, but I also would hope in your comments that you would spend some time talking about the things that divide us and how to be able to, with strategy and commitment, step into those things.
Great. So first, scale, stories, solidarity. I'm not sure I said it, but I will claim it. As any good academic, I will, the first time, credit Joseph. The second time, I'll forget. And the third time, I'll say, as I have long argued, there are 3 S's. I will get to that question, but here are my kind of thoughts. First, it's striking to me that I have a PhD in economics. I got it from UMass Amherst, which particularly at that time was famous for its Marxist economics program. So it's striking to me that I'm more optimistic about business than Judy. And maybe that's because I need business to step up. I mean, the reality is I've been trying to rack my mind to find an instance in which business was a main player against an authoritarian takeover. Instead, you see a lot of rent seeking going on, for example, around how to get the best tariff deal, rather than to understand that Liberation Day, while it was seemingly about tariffs, was actually a declaration against global interdependence. We could be separate from the rest of the world. We're only winning when they're losing, which is a parallel with a declaration of war against domestic interdependence, that we actually need each other. So I'm worried about business, but I also know that there's an element of business that recognizes that in the long run, I have an endowed chair at USC, which probably impresses no one at UC Berkeley, right? They must just give those out. But I asked the guy who endowed it, who was pretty wealthy and there's a fair amount of money associated with the chair, how did you become so rich? And he said, well, I treated my customers right, I treated my workers right, I treated my suppliers right, and it worked out. And we know that there are rapacious businesses, but David knows who those are, but also knows who the good employers are, who recognize that treating everyone right in our economy is actually going to yield a much better set of outcomes. And how is it that we animate that sector of business so it doesn't think of this as just do-gooderism, but as something that actually is responsible to live up to their mission? To the question you asked me to address, I was struck when David said he's now devoting his life to taking on this authoritarian. And that is to be celebrated. But I would also add that we need to take on the sickness within us, all of us, that has given birth to this phenomena. I've talked for some years about how we face three crises: the crisis of income distribution, the 1% running away from the rest, the professional middle class hanging onto those coattails, hoping that they might be along for that ride rather than so many others. The crisis in which people are fearful about the US becoming majority people of color, that somehow America will slip away. Again, something those of us from LA have never really understood, because we became majority people of color in 1988, and looking at the rest of the country, all we can think is, wow, soon you too will have a Korean taco truck. Right, and love it. And of course, the climate crisis, which is a crisis of not valuing the next generation or valuing our relationship with Mother Earth. And behind each one of those crises is a crisis of disconnection. Being fearful of the other racially, having an attitude around our economy that is not there but for the grace of God go I, but boy, am I glad I'm not that person. And of course, a disconnection from future generations of the planet. And the antidote to that is organizing. It's what unions do. It's what civil society is supposed to be good at. It's what faith-based organizing does. The last thing I'll say, Angela's looking at me like, I think you're done, but I'm not. So I want to take a moment to honor someone those of us from LA and even people from up here know, Kent Wong, who recently passed away. And Kent built, it was existing, but he really built up the UCLA Labor Center. He was someone, I've met so many young Asian American activists saying, wow, I saw a path because of Kent Wong. He was instrumental in the labor movement, at bringing people together when we had the crisis in LA of 4 Latino civic leaders, 3 council people, the head of the LA Fed, making anti-Black statements and having an anti-Black intent in their politics. It was Kent who worked with the Fed, the Federation of Labor, to try to bring labor back together after that crisis. He was instrumental for the Dreamers. He launched the first Dream Summer. So many of those students went on to advocate for DACA and are engaged in the struggle now to try to get the UC system to allow them to work for paid employment. So a giant. He's also someone I knew and met when I was 17 years old. We started college together at UC Santa Cruz. We both organized for the UFW. We did student organizing to try to support the boycott. Kent went to UC Berkeley, so I stayed behind, and the UFW figured out that I could fix cars, and they had me start repairing their vehicles rather than protesting. I literally helped the movement move with that work. We reconnected some years later. Our families grew up together. I've known their kids since they were very little. They've known ours. Our birthdays were 2 days apart, and we would celebrate every year together. And Kent, being the most thoughtful person I know, and Asian, would always bring me a gift. And I, being Latino, would forget. The next year I would remember, and Kent would thoughtfully forget so he wouldn't embarrass me. And I've had to talk about this, and when I talk about it, what I've said is that my heart is broken. And it really is. I know yours is too, David. But my back is strong and my mind is clear. We know that if we're motivated to fight for justice, it's because our heart's broken. Because either something happened to us or something happened to someone dear to us that we know is unfair, that we know is wrong, and we know to remedy. And so much is about to be broken. So many of our hearts are about to be ripped asunder. But civil society is not just about our pain. It's about our strategy, having a clear mind, and in this moment, having a strong back, being willing to stand up and not be mealy-mouthed about what is descending upon the country and what needs to be resisted.
This is the end of our panel, and I had hoped to be able to bring more of your voices in, but I hope that you enjoyed hearing the voices that were here. And I want you to know, David Wilson, that it makes me proud that we can be at a university talking about public policy at the Goldman School and struggle with why we have to talk about this. Why we have to talk about this. Because if we can't figure out how to do public policy in a way that emboldens the people who are working for the North Star, that if we can't figure out how to be able to fund, to support, to learn from those who are closest to the ground, and if we can't realize that the differences among those of us who are working in this way are as profound as the nation's differences, and figuring out how to get the Black janitors and the Latino security guards to figure out that they have one interest is as hard as it gets. Thank you.